Welcome to the Burlington Consensus, where we are convening scientific experts from academia, professional bodies, and scientific societies from around the world, together with leading policymakers to present widespread support for the establishment of a new global science policy interface for chemicals, waste, and pollution. This international event is hosted jointly by the Royal Society of Chemistry and the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA, as the government body responsible for chemicals policy here in the United Kingdom. We have a panel with us here today at the Royal Society of Chemistry in Burlington House in London. And this is a global hybrid event with many international attendees joining us online today. My name is Dr. Camilla Alexander-White, and I lead the Chemicals Policy Programme at the Royal Society of Chemistry. I'm a fellow of the RSC and a chemical safety assessor sitting on a number of government science advisory committees here in the UK, and I'll be chairing and facilitating the event today. We have our panellists here with us today, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. Firstly, Tom Welton.
So hello everyone, I'm Tom Welton and I'm Professor of Sustainable Chemistry at Imperial College London, and I currently have the pleasure of being President of the Royal Society of Chemistry.
Thank you, Tom. And Matt Davidson.
Hi everyone, my name is Matthew Davidson. I'm a Professor of Sustainable Chemical Technologies, so I have one more word in my title than Tom does, at the University of Bath. And I have interest in sustainable catalysis and doctoral training and innovation and all sorts of things.
Thank you, Matt. And hopefully we have Dr. Vicky Gardner from Australia, very early in Australia over there. Welcome.
Thanks, Camilla. So yes, my name is Dr. Vicky Gardner and I'm the President of Commonwealth Chemistry. And I don't practice chemistry anymore, I must say, but really enjoy that working in that connection between science, policy, and government and industry.
Thank you, Vicky. Nice to see you. Dr. Richard Daniels.
Hello, everybody. Richard Daniels. I'm Director of the Chemical Regulations Division, which is part of the Health and Safety Executive, and we are the Great Britain regulator for workplace health and safety. In particular, my division deals with the chemical regulation, for example, REACH, biocides, pesticides, etc., and feel a little bit of an interloper here as a physicist by background, but nonetheless a great deal of involvement with chemical regulation.
Not at all, Richard. Very welcome to Richard. And you will notice that Minister Jo Churchill is not with us on the panel today because she has been called at short notice to a vote in Parliament this afternoon. But we are very pleased to have Dr. Rachel Irving in her place. Rachel?
Hi, if Richard is an interloper, I most certainly am, as my doctorate's in history. Rachel, I'm the Deputy Director for Chemicals, Pesticides and Hazardous Waste in the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs here in the UK.
Thanks, Rachel. So that's our panel today. The event will take the form of a panel discussion where each of our panellists will present a short speech, followed by a discussion with a range of invited delegates who are with us today. They were asked to submit questions in advance, and we will try to get through as many of those questions today as we can in the time allotted. There's also the opportunity as well for any attendee to submit questions in the chat, and we'll look at those later at the end of the meeting if the time allows. The Royal Society of Chemistry advocates in the Burlington Consensus that there is an urgent need for improved global UN-led coordination of the world's best independent scientific advice into global policy making on chemicals, pollution and waste. We are expecting this to be discussed at the upcoming United Nations Environment Assembly, which is scheduled to start on the 28th of February this year. Chemicals bring so many benefits to our lives, but we cannot live without them. On the other hand, we know that there is rapid global growth in chemicals that has outstripped the potential to manage them effectively in some parts of the world. Governments need to act now to minimize chemical pollution that is causing harm to the environment or adversely affecting the health of human populations. We'll hear from our panelists and invited delegates today that in recent years, the lack of a global science policy interface for chemicals and waste has been identified as a key gap in being able to achieve global targets for chemical and waste pollution. But we also see that climate and net zero targets and biodiversity loss targets are not being met, which are intrinsically connected to the wider chemicals landscape. Before we begin our panel discussion today, let us watch a short video that provides some background context and perspectives from a range of influential voices.
First of all, I want to congratulate the Royal Society on Chemistry and the United Kingdom Government's Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA, for the timely organization of this event and thank them for the opportunity to participate. Our society needs chemicals. Hundreds of thousands of them contribute to our livelihood, food and goods production, and to our health. But many of them pose a threat to the environment and human health at different stages of their life cycle. Unfortunately, our societies only have a patchy knowledge in this field. We do need science to address this problem and to inform society and policymakers on their actions, aiming at the sound management of chemicals and waste.
Chemical waste and pollution form a global problem that needs to be addressed at a global scale, with many countries working together to achieve the same goal. The European Chemical Society strongly supports that a new and independent platform is established that is broadly supported by governments and other stakeholders around the world, and it has the task to make concrete steps forward towards a safe and healthy environment for all of us.
Chemical pollution is a serious global environmental problem alongside climate change and biodiversity loss. At present, there is a gap in the science policy interface on chemicals, pollution and waste. But there is strong scientific support in Europe and indeed globally for the creation of an intergovernmental panel on these topics.
I believe this new intergovernmental body should have the same status as the IPCC, as the potential harm of environmental pollution from chemicals is as great a threat to our precious natural environment as emissions that are changing our climate. Public policymakers hold our futures in their hands, and good policymaking requires access to knowledge and evidence. So policymakers need to establish close, confident and reliable links to those with world-leading expertise.
In December, the UK was proud to join with other like-minded countries in calling for an independent intergovernmental panel on chemicals, hazardous waste and pollution. The draft resolution to UNEA 5, which we have co-sponsored, seeks to set up a science policy panel that will provide independent, authoritative and policy relevant advice across that range of issues. It will also, we hope, further understanding of pollution as one of the three environmental crises of our time, alongside biodiversity loss and climate change.
With the increasing production of chemicals, waste and pollution in many parts of the world, evidence-based policy making is essential. This will require strengthening the science policy interface by developing an independent, open and transparent scientific process comparable to IPCC and IPBES that would critically assess the current and future burden of chemicals, waste and pollution, the implications for the environment and human well-being, and assess cost-effective and socially acceptable policy response options.
So the chemical science community really can make the world a better place, and all of us here today have an unrivaled opportunity to do just that. So now is the time to show the UN the strength of collective feeling from science and from policy in the UK, across Europe and the wider world, that with an intergovernmental panel on chemicals, waste and pollution, we can protect our environment and protect our society and save countless lives.
So as we can see from that video, there are some really good, strong voices of support. As well, there are 2 sign-up campaigns that are active at the moment to show your support for action. The International Panel on Chemicals Pollution, the IPCP, have a sign-up campaign for individuals to sign, and this is now active on the IPCP website, which will be on that slide. And as well, the Royal Society of Chemistry started a complementary campaign towards the end of last year, where organisations can support a declaration statement made by the RSC by adding their organisational logo. And here are some of the international organisations that have added their support to date, and it continues to grow. We'll show this information again at the end of the webinar if you would like to add your name or your logo to either of these campaigns. But now it's time to start the panel discussion. And as I mentioned at the top of the event, Minister Jo Churchill can't be with us today, but she very helpfully recorded a statement and a speech this morning, which we can now play.
Good evening, everyone, and I'm so sorry that I can't be with you this evening. I was really looking forward to discussing this incredibly important topic in person. However, it's a pleasure to be sending you this message. We all know that the planet is facing three urgent and interlinked crises, that of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. These are complex global issues which are accelerating at an unprecedented rate. A concerted and systematic global effort is required if we are to set nature on the path to recovery. One of the themes that sat at the heart of the UK's COP26 presidency. Now, making good on our commitment to the Sustainable Development Goal 12.4 for the sound management of chemicals and waste is critical to ensuring environmental protection and recovery. And this goal cannot be achieved without strengthening the connection between scientific evidence and policy making. Now, to make sure that accurate, cutting-edge research reaches policymakers and is used in an effective manner, the climate change and biodiversity loss crises have the independent intergovernmental panels of the IPCC and the IPBES. Now, pollution is on its own. It's desperately lacking such a body, hampering our ability to fill knowledge gaps and spot potential risks and opportunities that are heading down the track. Global industrial sales of chemicals exceeded $5 trillion, and this figure is predicted to double by 2030. With global supply chains and the trade of chemicals and products becoming increasingly complex, it's vital to take a global government-led view on this issue. Hazardous chemicals and other pollutants continue to be released into the environment in large quantities, with the benefits of action to minimize adverse impacts estimated in the high tens of billions of dollars annually. Now, our response needs to be correspondingly urgent and ambitious to protect human health and the environment while we still can. And whilst we recognize the challenges, we must not undervalue the opportunities which are to be won from the advancement of the chemical industry. Its innovation continues to provide society with benefits from resource-efficient technologies through to managing the threat of diseases like COVID-19. The expertise held in the industry must be combined with that of our academic experts to guide and galvanize international action to realize those benefits whilst also addressing the challenges through a credible, transparent, and authoritative science policy interface. As a community, we need to develop clear goals, measurable targets, and reliable mechanisms to make sure that we can deliver safe and effective management of chemicals and waste. And the assessments from the panels, such as the one proposed, can provide, will be essential in ensuring we focus our attention in the right direction. Because by horizon scanning for emerging issues and opportunities, the panel will allow policy to be smart, targeting the right interventions at the right times and in the right places to maximize our impact. A panel could make key advice available at a faster pace minimizing adverse outcomes, and promote sustainable and green solutions. It could reduce pollution by increasing awareness and making the case for increased resources, and galvanize international resolve, driving forward positive interventions for us all. Now, the UK are co-sponsors of the resolution to establish an intergovernmental science policy panel to support action on chemicals, waste, and pollution, as we feel that an independent panel of this nature is crucial in achieving this concerted, united effort. Now, we strongly encourage other UNEA parties to support the resolution, and I very much hope to be able to catch up with this evening's discussion later and hear what the panel's contributions are. I am sure that this is only the very start of a really exciting discussion, and I look forward to being with you in person in the near future. Thank you and have a good evening.
Some inspiring words from Joe Churchill there. Our next panelist will be Professor Tom Welton.
Thanks, Karen. So as Professor of Sustainable Chemistry, one of the things that I'm most often asked is, what do I mean by sustainable chemistry? And I always bring it back to the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 of them. Some of them are obviously technical, affordable energy, for instance. Some of them are much more societal, gender equality. But I would say that there is not a single one of these sustainable goals that chemistry, chemical scientists, and chemical products can't contribute to. And in fact, I'd go further. I don't think for most of these, they can be achieved without the benefits that chemistry and chemical products can bring. However, we have to do that whilst being responsible about our production and consumption of those chemicals. And that finds itself in the Sustainable Development Goal 12 and 12.4 that we've just heard of, that I'm sure we will come back to again. But I think that we can't fool ourselves that the choices will be easy, that policymakers will find themselves where every time they have a proposed intervention, it will always be positive for all sustainable development goals at the same time. There will be very tough choices to be made, and they can only be made on the basis of the strongest possible scientific advice. And that will require new knowledge. It will require the translation of that new knowledge into innovation, and the translation of that innovation into commercialization. It's not just the policymakers, it's the innovators and the industrialists who will be facing these choices. So in order to do that, we need to have a form of scientific advice which is as strong as it can possibly be. And so just to ask yourself, what should the characteristics of that be? It has to be global in the sense of around the world. It has to be global in the sense of inclusive of voices from across the world. And it has to be global in the sense of all-encompassing of those various different sustainable development goals. That is a huge task. You cannot do that by breaking it up into many different parts that somehow somebody at some point is going to coordinate. It has to, from the outset, be global in that respect. And then it can be authoritative. But also, to be authoritative, it has to have the right people around the table. It needs to be inclusive. It needs to have a range of voices from across the world, but a range of voices from different disciplines and different perspectives. It should not exclude any particular groups. In order to be authoritative, it can then, once it's authoritative, it can then be more credible. One of the issues that we faced over the last decades is that the scientific advice that has been coming to policymakers has been too often challenged as somehow bonkers and extreme. And as we've gone on through time, we have discovered more and more how central it is. That credibility is absolutely vital. But to achieve that credibility in a world of various different voices, it absolutely has to be independent. Independent of political control, independent of any particular hobby horse. It needs to be able to direct itself. And with these characteristics, then good scientific advice can be provided. And that is provided by the IPCC IPBES model. And so it is vital that we move forward with that model.
Thank you, Tom. Our next speaker is Matt Davidson.
Thanks, Camilla. It's a real pleasure for me to be here today, and I'm delighted that the UK government and the Royal Society of Chemistry are really showing global leadership in supporting the creation of an independent intergovernmental panel for action on chemicals, waste and pollution. I think the urgent case has been well made by Tom and by the Minister and by the experts you saw in the video earlier. I would like to focus, I think, just in the few minutes I've got here before the discussion starts, on the needs and opportunities that this provides for the UK science base in education, in research, in innovation, and in training. An intergovernmental panel will focus on actions that need to be taken. Many of those will be driven, of course, by science, as Tom's already made that point. So a new panel will stimulate research and innovation, and this is a really important point. It will stimulate research and innovation in the areas needed to mitigate the chemical pollution. In the area of green and sustainable chemistry, I think it's fair to say that the UK already punches well above its weight and is positioned to make important contributions to mitigating pollution, to developing cleaner products, to developing cleaner processes, cleaner materials, enabling resource efficiency, and to develop new circular approaches to minimizing waste. All of these things are important. And just by way of comparison, I think it's probably important to note that there's no doubt that the pace of innovation in, for example, renewable energy, which is underpinned itself by fundamental science, has really been accelerated by the work of the IPCC. I think we could see that translated to this new intergovernmental panel with respect to the science base in chemical pollution. Just to take one example where this might happen, and it's an example that's close to my heart, I guess, and that's the role of catalysis in enabling action on chemical pollution. Again, the UK is really well placed here. This could be achieved through developments in catalysis, for CO2 utilization, for the production of green hydrogen, for example, for clean chemical processes, and for resource efficient medicines manufacture, just to name a few things that could be impinged here. In terms of innovation, this of course requires academia, and again, this point has been made already, but I'd like to reinforce it. It requires academia and industry to work together and to train people, particularly PhD students and skilled people, to work together on innovating those things and taking them through to commercial application where they can really have an impact. And that brings me on to the last point I think I want to make, which is about education and training. For such a panel to be effective, I think it's absolutely vital that it has high caliber inputs in order to solve global challenges. And this means that it's vital to train tomorrow's leaders in green and sustainable technologies in order to understand, to communicate the wider implications of the science and engineering beyond the fundamental scientific work that they do. There really is a strong interest in tomorrow's leaders already in the societal and policy aspects amongst undergraduate and PhD scientists and engineers. And we really need to build on this. And this will be catalyzed by such an important development as this intergovernmental panel. So I think just to summarize, I wholeheartedly support and welcome the UK's leadership in this area. Its implementation would provide considerable impetus for global research effort to mitigate chemical pollution. And that would lead to a clean and green future, which I think is what we all want and all require. The UK science base is well placed with support of government and industry to take leadership in delivering the necessary research, training and innovation. And I'll just finish by saying I don't think the challenges, large as they are in this area, are insoluble. There are technical, scientific solutions that can be implemented to make the situation a whole lot better, but it really needs to be catalyzed in a metaphorical sense, if you like, by this panel.
Thank you, Matt. Now over to Australia, to Vicky Gardner.
Thanks, Camilla. And I'm going to take this opportunity to introduce to you Commonwealth Chemistry as its inaugural president, and just talk about how we see the organisation and the federation participating in the outcomes, I think, for a more global perspective in that respect. So Commonwealth Chemistry is a federation of the Commonwealth chemical societies that aims to strengthen scientific capacity, inspire and elevate the role of the chemical sciences to society and policymakers, and to celebrate achievements in chemistry. In doing so, it combines shared strengths, values, and similarities of its members, aligned closely with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, and upholds the core values of the Commonwealth. Most notably among these values is that of equity, which is why we have chosen our vision, one community, one voice, catalysing equality for all. Our mission is to inspire, celebrate, and elevate the role and practice of chemical sciences for the benefit of the Commonwealth nations and their people. Commonwealth Chemistry represents an important step forward in elevating the profession and the role of the chemical sciences in tackling the shared problems set out in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. As mentioned earlier, chemistry always has and always will continue to play an important role in global development, and this is why Commonwealth Chemistry is committed to progressing the UN SDGs through sharing research and building impactful relationships through the chemistry community. While Commonwealth Chemistry is essentially only 2 years old, we have been focusing on equal representation, gender diversity, and the translation of research to market through early career chemist events, seminars, and our inaugural Commonwealth Chemistry Congress. The latter brought policymakers, industry, and academic scientists together to build global networks and to discuss the latest issues and emerging research relating to the Sustainable Development Goals. We have also published our report entitled A Sustainable Chemistry Workforce for a Sustainable Future to understand the challenges facing early career research chemists across the Commonwealth. What this report found is that early career chemists in low and middle income countries face bigger hurdles than their peers in high income countries, and that women in particular face greater challenges than men. These challenges include collaborating with colleagues across the Commonwealth, and this is exacerbated by the lack of funding for travel and networking opportunities, particularly for those in low and middle income countries. An insight from our activities thus far is that chemical scientists from all Commonwealth countries are eager to engage in global matters through their research, with 9 out of 10 early career chemists surveyed are working on the topics relating to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The countries that make up Commonwealth are rich in diversity of culture, opportunities, and geographical locations. While united around the Sustainable Development Goals, each country brings its own perspective, challenges, and solutions that are unique for its people and geography. This is the advantage of Commonwealth Chemistry as a forum to engage in discussion relating to chemicals and waste management, as the effects of chemicals, waste, and pollution are felt globally by all people on this earth, some more than others. Commonwealth Chemistry can play the role in bringing a diversity of voices to the discussion, including low and middle income developing countries, in order to overcome the barriers identified in the IPCP multi-stakeholder workshop on strengthening the science policy interface on international chemical governance. Consistent with our recent climate change policy statement, Commonwealth Chemistry supports the call for our governments to ensure scientific evidence sits at the heart of addressing chemical and waste management. And importantly, It is the global chemical profession that can help define and provide solutions to addressing this issue. But what do I see as a positive consequence of a new science policy interface for chemicals and waste? I see it becomes a platform for building our profession's capability and capacity. A global framework will be the catalyst to enhance international collaboration by providing clear pathways and focus. And we might even build a few new chemical industries in the process. With global agreement on priorities, it will assist to advocate for increased funding and opportunities for our early career chemists. And it is where Commonwealth Chemistry will play a part to facilitate these relationships and opportunities, supporting early career chemists to develop crucial non-technical skills, champion equality in chemistry, and facilitate knowledge sharing across the Commonwealth and with policymakers. Can you imagine a chemical sciences community and government decision makers working together on chemical safety, managing waste, and improving environmental health and social issues? I'd like to see that. Thanks.
Thank you, Vicky. That's excellent contribution there from Vicky on behalf of Commonwealth Chemistry. And our final speaker is Richard Daniels.
Thank you, Camilla. I'm coming from a perspective of somebody that spent 30 years in regulation and working for an organisation, the Health and Safety Executive, that's had nearly 50 years of regulatory experience. And at the heart of what we probably learned and the model that we have is that you've got to have policy and science and operational delivery joined up very closely together across the system to have most impact on making a difference to address those issues that need solving. And if you lack any one of those corners of a triangle, then you're not going to succeed in the best way. Science informs policy, policy directs operational delivery identifies issues that science needs to contribute to. So from that perspective, the science policy panel will fill that gap on joining up two essential elements of that totality, I think, of chemical regulation and the management of chemicals at the moment that isn't getting a voice in the space of chemicals, waste and pollution. I think Tom said in terms of authoritative outputs and credibility, which is absolutely essential that comes out from a platform. And the proposals do provide that space for that, but also that it's relevant and legitimate. It will allow scientists to work together across boundaries to review evidence systematically, and most importantly, drive evidence-based policy decisions. So policy that is informed and rooted back into the best science and collective wisdom. In terms of breaking down barriers or gaps between regulatory scientists in academia, or whether that's government and the private sector, if you can close information gaps or knowledge gaps and learn from each other and get that interaction on cross-cutting issues, then that does drive to faster solutions. And we've got great experience of that, of bridging gaps, and it works where you draw on collective experience wherever people sit in whatever organization or whatever country of coming together. Certainly a forum that provides increased awareness and public understanding of some of the challenges that come from chemicals management and waste and pollution. What are the issues but the opportunities? And Matthew talking about there are solutions out there, it can be driven, can come through, I think is really important. And you know, what's holding us back? Well, where is that awareness? Where is that collective understanding of issues that policymakers hold? There isn't the space, there isn't the visibility, there isn't the prominence that perhaps the committees on climate change and biodiversity have. And that's a clear gap in providing that voice and that forum of people coming together. Now, the proposals, and I think it was about diversity of access and representation. That includes clearly having industry having an input. The philosophy of HSE in Great Britain is very much those that create the risk have a responsibility for controlling, for managing, for coming up to solutions for that. And therefore it's absolutely important that the industry voice is part of that contribution to the solution, because it's that scale that's where solutions will be delivered. But of course, without and safeguarding conflicts of interest or lobbying or capture into the system, but absolutely come together to make the system in totality the best. And again, a forum that brings together the best scientific minds, whatever the background, wherever people come from, whatever the situation they are in, that collectively that they can input, whether that is for personal development and growth and for the future and building experience, or whether it is just to add what they know to the system, has to be absolutely important in reaching the best and highest quality assessments that the system can deliver at a global level. And lastly, I think the connection, as I've said, across all the players and the increased visibility and the increased communication and the pace at which that needs to happen does mean now at this point in time, the bit of the burning platform of imperative to seize the opportunity now to start addressing the issues in chemical waste and pollution that's facing the world, so we leave a legacy for those that are coming by preserving what we have now. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And we have Rachel. I don't think you've prepared a speech because you're standing in valiantly for Joe Churchill today, but you're here to field the questions on behalf of DEFRA as well, aren't you? So that's the end of our formal speeches, and we move into a discussion period now where there are some questions. There are delegates on the line who will have access to your own videos. If you want to join in any of these discussions, please raise your hand on the Zoom webinar tool, and a colleague of mine will bring you into the discussions. But we have a set of 7 questions that have been put forward by delegates in advance of today's panel that I'm going to work through progressively and give the panel members an opportunity to respond back. But do feel free as well, if you are a delegate for the meeting, to join in the conversation online as well. We already have one hand up.
I think it's Professor Graham Hutchings. Would you like to speak?
That's Professor Graham Hutchings. Would you like to make a comment?
Yeah, I hope you can hear me okay. I very much enjoyed those speeches, or whatever you call them at this stage. And I'm sorry I didn't put a question before, but I really want to listen to things before I asked a question or made a point. So I like the clean and green future. That's really, really good. And a lot of the points were raised that we know that we're going to need new knowledge to be able to do this. So I suppose the question is, what new mechanisms are needed at this point, do people think? Because surely if we had everything in place now, we would have solved these problems. We wouldn't be where we are now. So, you know, there's probably political things that have stopped that, I don't know, but we are where we are. So what new mechanisms are needed, or what needs to be restarted to really get things going within the wider community?
We'll capture that question, Graham, because we do have an order of events, but that is really an important question to hold on to, and we will pick that up at the end there. So if we can capture that, we'll put that on at the end for you. Thank you for that, Graham. Okay, so we'll start with our first question online. Is Mike Holland on the line?
I am, yes.
Hello, Mike. Would you like to
Hello.
ask your question?
Yes, environmental policies are often compartmentalized, for example, to chemicals or to air pollution or to climate or to waste and so on, with little or no consideration of common ground across those compartments. That has consequences for the efficiency and effectiveness of policy. And with that in mind, what boundaries do panelists consider apply to the pollution component of a global panel on chemicals, waste and pollution?
Thank you, Mike. Is there anyone who would particularly like to answer that question first?
I can
Tom?
jump in. Thank you, Mike. So, I mean, in one sense, the answer to your question is none. That to at this stage put boundaries on what such a panel would consider to be in its remit it's premature. you know, the whole point of the independence is that the panel will determine what those boundaries are. For myself, you know, I think that, you know, the idea of pollutant that I feel most comfortable with is a chemical or material that is in a place where you don't want it. And of course, that encompasses a lot. What you then need to do is to prioritize which of those require action and which of those require action immediately. And that is just the kind of thing that this panel would be addressing, I'm sure, as one of its first issues.
Thanks, Tom. Rachel? Yeah.
I think it's really important, actually, as you said, that we ensure that we have a wide boundary around this. One of the worst things we could do is try and already silo the work of the panel. We've seen really in the wide range, the wide remit of both ICBES and IPCC, that where panels have a wide remit, they often do their best work. Now, I know that there's some concern about where the panel ought to focus its time, and whether, you know, the extent to which this is a panel that is primarily focused on chemicals, pollution, or indeed on waste. Having a wide remit doesn't preclude a focus on particular topics, but I think drawing that wide base initially is really important. We also need to make sure that the panel is set up in such a way that it can support governments around the world, including in low and middle income countries. And so we need to be able to set it up on a wide basis so that we can ensure that it is able to respond to those divergent needs. So I think we should start wide. We go into the open-ended working group and negotiate, obviously, but the best approach, I think, is to ensure that we are not putting in artificial silos from the beginning.
Thanks, Rachel. Any further comments?
I could just add very briefly to that. I mean, I agree with what Tom said, and you know, Rachel was talking in more practical terms. So I guess from a sort of intellectual viewpoint, there's an issue in compartmentalizing the problem with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from the problem of microplastics in the ocean. I mean, you know, they all have a common solution, which is cleaner and greener and more benign and more sustainable processes. So, you know, I think at that level, I think the sentiment of the question is exactly right. We shouldn't compartmentalize these things. We should view all man-made chemical distribution as part of the remit from an intellectual point of view.
Okay. So I think there's further questions online.
There's a question from Rachel Kupka from the Global Alliance on Health and Pollution.
GAP, hello. Rachel, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you so much. And to add to what Tom and Rachel and the panelists are saying, we do know that pollution causes 9 million premature deaths each year. So it's really the largest environmental risk factor for death on the planet. And much of this comes from chemicals. And we do also know that this is an undercount, right? A lot of chemicals, we don't even have an established burden of disease, let alone the disease burden dose response relationships. But it is clear that chemicals are a very needed part of life, and when managed properly, we can protect human health and environmental health. And so this panel, in its quest to provide a science policy interface and do horizon scanning, is absolutely critical. From our perspective, we also would like to encourage a panel such as this to really focus on what are also the biggest current threats, not just what potential threats are, because there are many current threats. I think someone in the chat is talking about mercury and heavy metals. This is absolutely the case. We have currently 1 in 3 children with elevated blood lead levels globally. This is a huge number of people. And we also know that lead is causing 1 million premature deaths alone. So when we look at the burden of disease from chemicals, lead is really up there. And so if we can't even as a global community manage these risks that we know to be poisoning people now and having huge impacts on the environment, how are we going to even tackle new and emerging threats? So it's really important that this panel look at health as Minister Churchill was emphasizing, look at health as a way in a way to not only prevent future impacts, but also address and mitigate current threats. And this is also what we are seeing as a global alliance of low and middle income country governments. You know, they're not concerned yet about PFAS and endocrine disruptors. They're trying to deal with heavy metals and pesticides. So it's important that this panel also tackles issues that are of major concern to the low and middle income countries that are truly least and worst positioned to tackle these huge chemical threats. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel, for that intervention. That moves us nicely on, actually, to question 2. Do we have Professor Jane Catherine Nagila from who is Acting Executive Director of the African Academy of Sciences? Catherine.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, Catherine is here. And quite excited to listen to various discussions. I'm a chemist by profession, so therefore this really resonates very closely as I grow up in, in the chemical labs, and we see a lot of disposals. We dispose because in some laboratories you don't find there is a systematic way. In other labs, you are supposed to be putting solid waste in one particular place, and maybe when it comes to the solutions, you put them in bottles, then later we're going to have disposal. Now my question, that is just a background. My question is, are there any global data on the nature of the biggest chemical pollution problems the world is facing? And secondly, do we know the scale of the challenge that we are faced with towards now to start for us to start addressing the chemical pollution? Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Who would like to answer that question? Any thoughts first? What about Rachel first? It's a general question.
Yeah, it's a general question. I might defer to colleagues on the panel for more specifics. I mean, I think there are a range of different issues, and it is really difficult to pull apart and kind of list out which are the most important. And partly, I mean, this goes back to what we were saying in the previous question. What might be more important for one country won't necessarily be the most important challenge for another country. And so I think the importance of this panel will be it being able to be independent and responsive to the needs, the challenges that various different countries are going through. So I think there needs to be a flexibility in that, because there will be things that are problematic in one place that won't necessarily be problematic in another. I think just to kind of carry on in that theme, what we would really like to see from this is a very sort of an agile science policy interface that is able to respond to those both existing and emerging threats. I would also add that the previous person who intervened talked a lot about human health, and that is absolutely going to be at the center of what we want to do here. But we also need to be responsive to the environmental impacts of pollution, and in particular the way that environmental pollution interacts with both the climate change and the biodiversity agenda. And so I would like to see a degree of discussion between the panels as well, so that we can take a really holistic view of some of those. So that is a very non-specific answer on the specifics, but needless to say, I don't think there probably is one answer, and we need to make sure this panel is inclusive so that we can tackle a range of issues.
Tom, thank you.
So I shall answer yes and no, and the reason for that is it's terribly patchy. And for instance, we heard about lead in the previous contribution, and please let me get it right. I think it was in the Lancet the year before last. There was a big report on lead and its effects on human health. Only last year, there was a report from my own university, Imperial College, saying that the lead to which the children in the schools around where I live in central London, 50% of it is made up from legacy lead from before we banned leaded petrol here in the UK, which was over 20 years ago. And so there are some things about which there is quite a lot of information. There are others, again, we heard mention of PFAS, about which a lot is known, but there are huge gaps in our knowledge across the piece. And some of that is because genuinely, you know, the chemicals are ones that haven't really been studied in depth. Others are that in some parts of the world, there's good analysis and good data, whereas in others it's poor. And so it's extremely patchy. And that is, I talked about the global nature of this panel. That is why it needs to be global. It needs to be able to fill these holes, and you can't fill those holes if you're sitting all in the same place, all with the same experience, all with the same backgrounds, because you will all see the same thing and you will miss the gaps. And that's why it's so vital that this panel is global in that regard.
Any contribution?
I think.
Yeah, Richard.
I think the other thing that I would sort of add to that and agree with everything that's said before. One of the philosophies around in the world of regulation in terms of Professor Malcolm Sparrow, which was identify the big wicked problems, work out something, attempt to tackle them and then move on. So it very much is about targeting, but not missing where there might be common solutions. So I think it is one of those of perhaps the no boundaries to start with, but there will be limited resources. So what do you get the best impact from the application of those resources that has importance to any particular locality, region or nation, and then on the global scale. So I think it isn't one size fits all in the solution of what needs to be done, where it needs to be done, and what it needs to be addressing, but clearly a forum that can have that honest, open and constructive discussion that I think takes you to the next step. I think there is something very much about by bringing together the different experiences and avoiding the groupthink, but also drawing on experiences of people or countries that have addressed an issue and moved on, but actually that same issue is being addressed by another part of the world. So there may be known solutions already. It's a question of transfer and application coming through that to be delivery. And I think the third bit, and just coming back to one of the early bits about the deal with the issue now and the future to some extent may not be you know, as a burning platform in immediacy. I think it's a balance of both. It clearly is fixed the now, but the farther out you can intervene and stop something becoming a problem, sometimes the less effort and resources it needs to take you to prevent that becoming the next big thing. So again, I think in terms of remit and boundaries, it's not all about the now, it is about the future. It is a blend, and then coming to a consensus therefore about what to do about it. Sorry.
Matt.
Yeah, just a very quick point, couple of very quick points to add to this. I think the simple answer to your question from my point of view is yes, there is a deficit of data, and globally, and there was a publication only last week, I think, from the Stockholm Resilience Centre that talked about novel entities, which includes chemical pollution crossing a planetary boundary for exactly that reason. So there clearly is work to be done on developing data. And just another point about that is that as we move towards a more circular economy in all of these things, traceability of chemicals becomes more and more important. So I think this intergovernmental panel, if it catalyzes that research, and of course there are solutions available and research that can be done to hugely improve traceability, to identify future problems, for example, and to deal with the issue of a circular economy where you know, we're potentially building up these problems for ourselves in the future. So that's just a couple of points to add to that, but it's a really important point about data.
Thanks, Matt. So we've got some sense of the urgency and scale of the problem. I'd now like to bring in Professor Sir Bob Watson, if you're there to ask your question, coming back to some of the practicalities, I think.
Yes, thank you very much. As most people know, I've actually chaired both IPCC and IPBES at different stages, as well as some other assessments on stratospheric ozone depletion. There's no question, in my opinion, that an IPCC IPBES type assessment can strengthen the science policy interface. And I think those assessments can actually be easily adapted to the issue of chemicals, waste and pollution. A big difference is it's industry that holds much proprietary information on chemicals and waste, which is very different, of course, from the situation in climate change and biodiversity. Just a quick comment on boundaries, if I may. I agree with the comment about not putting boundaries, but I do think it's very important, and a lot of governments will say this, that one must make sure that any new process for chemicals and waste doesn't duplicate IPCC and doesn't duplicate IPBES. So there probably will be boundaries in the sense that a new assessment process needs to be complementary and working with the IPCC and IPBES. So the question I really have is a very simple and practical one. A new process will be at least $4 to $6 million a year, no question. IPCC is probably 7 or 8 million. IPBES is now 6 or 7 million. And so any new process has to be in some significant number of millions of dollars. Is the UK government truly willing to put what a fair share would be in, which is at least $500,000 a year, probably more? And have you yet been working with partners abroad in Europe, with China, India, the US, to see if that money is available? Because that's one of the big issues that you will face is, can we raise the money to fund this? And it must not be underfunded. An underfunded process will not work. So one has to be honest about the true cost of such a new process.
Thank you, Bob. I'm guessing Defra will have a response to that question. Rich.
Always the government representative who gets the really interesting academic questions here. Well, first of all, start off by saying there's absolutely no point in having a panel that is under-resourced. It's probably more harm than good if it isn't resourced appropriately. But there will be questions about the level at which resourcing is appropriate. And what I don't want to do is to preempt the work of the open-ended working group should this be adopted at UNEA, because they will have a key role in discussing how this panel ought to be funded and governanced. I would make one slightly wider point in that I think the benefits of this panel ought to be able to sell themselves. I think if one of the things that we haven't talked so much about is the benefit of this panel in raising both public awareness and government awareness of some of these issues and the interlinkages between this biodiversity and climate change. If we think back 20 years to where we were on climate change, if it wasn't for the scientific community, it would never have been taken as seriously as it has been taken now, or is starting to be taken now. And the IPCC has been really critical in that. If we could get a panel that is agile, that it works for all of the stakeholders, and that it is authoritative and independent, and I hope that its work will make the case itself, and that will be half of the battle in trying to encourage the appropriate level of funding for such an enterprise.
So just coming back to Graham Hutchins' point, which is connected in a way about mechanisms and frameworks, do you want to just say a little bit more about how it may be anticipated the mechanisms might work? It's a difficult question.
That is a difficult question, and I think there's probably a number of different models, and we would want to look at how a number of the different models work in the international community to see which one is going to be the most responsive. Again, I would prefer that we had that conversation through the open-ended working group so that we can get the reflections of a number of different stakeholders and governments in that model, because there are a number of pros and cons into whatever model that we adopt. Clearly, there has to be funding, some level of funding from governments, and that has to be commensurate with the scale of the challenge that we're setting on.
Yeah, thanks. Anybody else have any comments to make on that point? No. Okay. All right, so we move on next to Professor Floris Rutgers from Radboud University. Floris, would you like to ask your question? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me first also say that I am also enjoying the discussion very much, also the one in the chat, which is rather extensive, I would say. But also as president of the European Chemical Society, I would also put in something from our perspective. And within our society, which is abbreviated with UChemist, we have developed a few years ago the UChemist periodic table, which was meant to draw attention to the scarcity of elements and also to the need of transforming into a recycling economy, where we start considering waste as a resource, or in other words, as it was phrased by the IUPAC president, Javier Garcia Martinez, that we should move to a chemistry of reuse. So my question is then, so this panel, will that mainly like signal the waste and pollution challenges and advise on setting rules for usage or limits for waste disposal, or will it also sort of guide towards solutions to address these problems, like moving into a more cyclic economy or other solutions?
Thanks, Lois. I guess that builds on your points, doesn't it, Matt, really, about innovation and solutions. Do you have anything to add on what you said previous?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question, Floris. We can't see the chat, so
anything could be happening.
Yeah, we'll look at it later.
Yeah, that would be good.
I don't really know. I mean, my viewpoint about this is that such a panel would catalyze and stimulate such solutions to be funded outside the panel in the same way as IPCC does. It doesn't tell us how to mitigate CO2, and you know, I think Graham's question actually, in terms of funding, just to come back to that, was more about how you fund those solutions. So it's more closely related to Floris's question rather than how you actually fund the panel itself.
Yeah, good point. Anybody else to add to that?
So my view would be that there would be no point having such a panel if all it were to do was to list off, here is a list of problems that we face. It absolutely will have to point in directions of potential solutions, indicate areas where innovation is required, but not be a funding agency. You know, it will be pointing out areas, as I say, where innovation is required, where more information is needed, a whole variety of different areas where we need to expand our knowledge and point to possible solutions, but not fund and not be the decision maker. It is not the role of an advisory group to make decisions. It is a role of an advisory group to advise and provide the evidence base from which the policymakers make the decisions.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Any points on that?
Vicky has her hand up.
Vicky, you have your hand up.
Yeah, it's one of those challenges when you're the remote person, isn't it? To say, oh, I'd like to have a comment.
It is.
I guess one of the just coming back to that point, I think one of the differences between this panel would face compared to the other two is the fact that it will need to consider demand for chemicals. So there's high demand in some countries compared to others, and what's the impact of increasing demand for electronic devices, for instance, and then how do we actually manage that whole of life cycle of both the compounds and chemicals and the products themselves? And I think that this is where some of the opportunities are in terms of being open in terms of the framework in what the panel will discuss. So as Tom mentioned, it can't be prescriptive. It needs to be open enough so that then on the smaller or on the country levels or regional levels, that they can actually take that as a guidance to be able to develop what it is that's needed locally. But in terms of some great examples of work that is being done, obviously Australia just had today is now the 27th of January. Back in the UK, it's obviously the 26th. I think that's right. Which was Australia Day, and one of our Australia of the Year people, Professor Veena Sejawala, I hope I said that right. She was New South Wales Australian of the Year, and her contribution was around that recycling of resources and the like. So her most notable invention is a polymer injection technology, which is repurposing carbon from old tyres to replace coking coal in steel production. other areas that she's worked on are the Sustainable Material Research Technology Centre at the UNSW, which is the first e-waste micro factory on campus, and they're also developing a plastics so they're taking the e-waste and repurposing the rare chemicals and the like. And then finally, you know, with the work that she was doing during the pandemic, she was taking plastics from old printers and making them into face shields for one of the local hospitals in New South Wales. So, you know, I think that there's lots of opportunities for the waste that we're using, but it's actually taking that whole of life perspective and then, you know, reusing those compounds and chemicals. And that's part of what this panel needs to be able to do, is just to be that open guidance so that it leads to opportunities for innovation.
Thanks, Vicky. Okay, so we have another hand up online, I believe.
Yeah, I think there's two from Professor Graham Hutchins and Sir Bob Watson.
Okay, Graham Hutchins, would you like to come back in?
Yeah, thanks. Matt interpreted my point quite rightly. I did assume the panel would be funded and would be operational. It's a sort of thinking, well, what innovative mechanisms can then be stimulated? And I'm not suggesting that you answer that. It's something that needs to be taken on board at the outset. You know, for example, centuries ago, there were key problems and governments faced key problems, and they then put on the table prize money to be won. One of these is the chronometer that solved longitude. Another was the French wine problem. You know, there are innovative ways of stimulating real innovation that can come out of communities. So rather than, you know, you're right, Tom, you're not going to be a funding organization. That's not the point of this. But can you somehow stimulate collectively to get these real innovative solutions? Because my point is, you know, a lot of the innovations could have been made had we been thinking in that direction at the present time, but clearly they haven't. So there has to be some change here.
Thanks, Graham. Bob, did you have a comment?
Yes, it's to respond to the last question by Floris. I will argue that the strength now of both IPCC and IPBES is to discuss the response options. Both assessments are very careful not to be prescriptive. They don't tell governments or the private sector or the public what to do, but they do give options. So they might say, if you want to achieve something, let's say reducing greenhouse gas emissions, these are your options. If you want to avoid something, these are your options. And so so both IPCC and IPBES are spending a lot of time looking at technological, economic, social and behavioral changes that can address whether it's climate change, loss of biodiversity. And I would expect that any new assessment on chemicals, waste and pollution would do the same. In fact, what the governments have been saying to IPBES and IPCC is, we want you to focus much more on the solution space than the problem space. Yes, identify what the problem are, but we already know what many of the problems are. What we're really interested in is, what's the range of options that we can think about, and where are the big knowledge gaps where we will need to fund additional research. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Any further comments on this point?
Well, there are a couple of questions from Adrian Clark. One is, how do we make this truly international? It's very well focusing on Europe, but with so many imported products of uncertain composition manufactured in developing countries, how do we insist on traceability and environmental safety? So
I hope you heard that. That was a question from Adrian Clark, who may be on the line, but I think it's about international cooperation, really. And again, it's quite naturally timed almost to lead on to another question. So we'll link that question to the next one, Adrian, which I hope Ninetta is on the line from UChems as well. Ninetta Rastelj, are you there? Thank you. Hello.
Hello, good evening from UChems again, I would say. I will stay with Europe still for the time being, and you may want to move later on to more global level. And as you probably know, EU Chemists is also participating in the high-level roundtable for implementation of the chemical strategy for sustainability, which has been set up by the European Commission last year. And my question would be, how could organizations like the European Chemical Society and, for example, IUPAC, which is global, which are involved in initiatives with a similar goal, contribute to the work of this new panel? And also, is there already a list of other stakeholders that are supposed to be or foreseen to be involved? And are there any ideas about the protocol to coordinate actions of this panel?
Thanks, Ninetta. So that's, a question about connecting people together. I wonder, Vicky, if you have a perspective on this as well from Commonwealth Chemistry and a global perspective.
Yeah, look, thanks, Camilla. I think it is absolutely vitally important, as we've mentioned a couple of times throughout the whole conversation thus far. It's very much it's a global issue, and while I mean no disrespect for anyone, the panel here is all white and of Caucasian background typically. So it's always it's going to be really important to make sure that we do have quite a diverse panel and makeup, and hearing voices from all around the world, from both high income countries, middle and low income countries. So, certainly how do we all collaborate? I think that's a really good question. We all have similar objectives for all the different organizations that we belong to. And I guess it's a matter for us as a community to be also communicating with each other to see how we can do things like the Royal Society of Chemistry has done here with panels that from different that include different organizations, and how we actually can bring people together, how we actually can be connected with an international panel as a source of knowledge and people to be able to inform the conversations that the panel has. I think it's a really good question.
Thanks. Good points. Anybody like to add to that? Matt?
I think it's a really important question, and to me it seems to be one of the real potential opportunities of such a panel. I mean, the European solutions to all of these problems are different from the North American solutions. So in high income countries, they differ hugely already. The real strength of a well set up intergovernmental panel like this is that it would be truly global, with voices truly global, and not just the European view or the North American view or the Australian view or whatever it is. That's really important.
I think, Rachel?
From a really practical point of view, I mean, we really, really want to see that there's regional balance in the governance of this panel. And I think that starts with the open-ended working group process, which we hope will start soon. We would like to see a diversity of voices in that open-ended working group and within the governance of the panel and the makeup of the panel, because I think if we can ensure the plurality of voices from the beginning in the setup of this, then we are much more likely to be able to come out with a panel that is truly diverse and responsive to a diverse set of needs. So we hope really that we will get good representation from different countries at both the open-ended working group and through the governance of this panel as well.
Thank you. Any more comments?
I think the only thing I would perhaps add is the difficulty for sort of governments to impose and create and make the diversity happen. Is always very, very difficult, and I think therefore to create the space, to create the mechanism, create the framework into which people step is important. So making sure that there are no barriers to preclude people, organizations, countries wanting to step in and actually contribute and their voices be heard, I think is absolutely the way forward. And so with the open-ended working group and looking at the sort of draft remit for it, it's precisely that. But I would say sort of everyone on the call, voice, and whether it's the Society of Chemistry here or UChems or whatever, it's almost step forward and step up to the challenge that's being offered. Don't wait to be asked or called upon.
Thank you, Richard. Any further points online?
Well, the next point, again, from Adrian Clark, leads to the next question very nicely, I guess, which is, what onus will be put on key industries
Yes, it
which
does
use
indeed.
chemicals
It's as
when it
if
comes
you-
to environment and human health, and does REACH needs to be extended in scope?
Thank you for that connection. It is indeed a timely connection and very, very natural one, really. If we're thinking about the diversity of cultures and geographies, it's really about the nature of the panel and industry participation. So we do move on to a couple of questions on that point as well. First one is from Roger Pullin. Are we still on mute, Roger?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, loud and clear.
Yep. Thank you, Camilla. My name is Dr. Roger Pullin. I work for the UK Chemical Industry Association, CIA, who represent chemical and pharmaceutical businesses throughout the UK. Thank you to both DEFRA and RSC for organising today's event. CIA supports strengthening the interface between science and policy making, and we're part of the International Council Chemical Associations, ICCA, who also support this in principle with some caveats, including that other committees retain their ability to decide on actions, and careful consideration is given of how best to protect proprietary and or confidential business information. The question we'd like to ask: how do the panelists see the role that the chemical industry can play in contributing to the new proposed science policy panel for chemicals and waste?
Thank you, Roger. Who would like to go first? Tom? Yeah.
Again, I think it's absolutely vital. You know, the inclusive means inclusive. That means, you know, that means everybody. You can't be selectively inclusive. And, you know, the simple truth is if you restricted people according to their employment history, their research collaborations that they've had, you'll have nobody who would be able to join this group. And, you know, there are people who have, you know, different skills and knowledge, and those skills and knowledge have to be brought to the table. And the truth is, the people that, you know, deliver the products that are around us are not academics, they are industries. And you have to bring the skills and knowledge of those industries into this panel. What I would say, though, just as if I were joining such a panel as an employee of Imperial College, I am not on that panel to represent Imperial College and its business plan. So you bring the skills, you bring the experience, you set up confidentiality, conflict of interest agreements so that that knowledge is brought to the table, but not with representing the business plan of individual companies or indeed industries.
Thank you. You have a comment, Richard?
Yeah, and Roger, thank you for that. And I would almost say, well, I don't think the panel can succeed, you know, to its optimum without the input from people coming from the chemicals industry, and not to harp back to you know, the day job, what I do, but you know, in the UK and the Health and Safety Executive, we work closely with industry. We work with the Chemicals Industry Association, you know, both in my part and other parts of the organisation, and federations and trade associations, etc., and unions, etc. And it's that collective part of, so who actually owns the problem we are trying to solve? Well, collectively, everybody owns it. Who has a part to solve? Well, everybody does. And I think, you know, Tom has, you know, hits it on the nail, which is what is your role whilst you are there and input into the system? And, you know, we do have models of success where industry is involved. And in terms of innovation, I think, as I said earlier, if we are looking at delivery mechanisms to solve the issues, you know, quite often it's not government that will go out there and solve the issues. It is through industry and it is through other networks that actually the solutions will come. And therefore, to cut out or preclude any input, you know, from the outset, I think almost you're destined to failure. So, you know, again, I would just say as well, step up and volunteer and offer with whatever caveats you have, you know, to the initiative.
Okay, Matt?
I'll just add a little bit to that. You know, I think the industry representation needs diversity as well. So, you know, people might be thinking of large global corporate industry, but that's not really what it's all about in many ways. A lot of the solutions will come from small, high growth, high tech, innovative, entrepreneurial, new industries. So, and that's where the solutions are going to come from.
Has Vicky got her hand up? Vicky, would you like to speak?
Yeah, thank you, Camilla. I guess the other thing to remember is that there, you know, whatever does come out of the panel in terms of its frameworks, there need to be such that it's fit for purpose. So when it comes to industry, you know, we can't be prescriptive in terms of additional or regulation that's for regulation's sake. It's actually got to be something that can be implementable, and thus the importance of chemical industry at the table. But I guess the other thing is that having both academic and industry having the conversation together, it does help with that translation of research to commercial applications. So it helps to build those relationships, which is what a lot of our members, our early career researchers were saying, is actually having those connections is really important and gives that focus to the research where the collaboration can occur.
Thank you. And to follow on that question, I'll bring in Emma Meredith. Are you on the line, Emma, to follow on?
Camilla, I am, Camilla. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for a very interesting debate. I work for a trade association representing the cosmetic and personal care industry, an industry based on science and very innovative. And both Professor Welton and in particular Professor Davidson mentioned innovation in their introductions. So as part of this initiative, do you envisage globally coordinated support for innovation as part of the action on chemicals pollution to help solve the pollution challenges, please?
Any comments? Would you like to go first?
So as I said earlier on, you know, I do not think that is necessarily the role of this particular body. This body will be pointing out areas where innovation is required. There will be different mechanisms for the funding and direct support of that innovation, research, etc.
Okay. Any further questions? Any more points online?
Well, we have a question from Alejandro, which is on what is the role of policymakers to contribute to a clean and green future, and how can they establish strong links between academia, science, and industry to face the challenges?
Any comments?
Could you repeat the first part of the
question?
Yeah,
the first one is, according to your experience, what is the role of policymakers to contribute to a clean and green future?
That's why we were looking at Rachel.
Yeah. That's a large question. I could maybe write a bit of a book on that one. Often, so if you take in a government context where I work, often the policymakers are the people who have the general experience. They are the people who are able to coordinate others. They're the people who are able to bring together probably what are the more salient questions and then allow the space for others who have more experience and more technical expertise, whether that be in science and evidence, or as was said before, in operational matters together to solve those problems. So policymakers often have that kind of convening and coordinating role and creating the spaces for those things, which is, you know, part of the reason why we're really keen to co-sponsor this particular initiative, because that would allow the space for those experts to be able to come together, identify problems, and then point in the direction of solutions. So I think we are really well placed to try and coordinate and support those efforts to ensure that those efforts are resourced to an appropriate degree, and then to listen. And that's, I think, the most important point. Good policy making involves listening, and it involves listening to a wide, diverse set of opinions, and then being able to kind of draw together what that potential list of solutions might be. So I think in this context, it's really about convening. It's about understanding what the most salient issues are in a particular region or country, and then listening to the advice that is given and really taking it due weight in consideration.
Thank you, Rachel. Any further points, Matt?
I'll just add something to that from a, let's say from a training and education point of view. This might not be something you hear every day, but policymakers genuinely inspire the the most socially responsible scientists and engineers, I think. Within our Centre for Doctoral Training, by far the most popular internships are with the Royal Society of Chemistry, with Chatham House, with Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, World Health Organization. They're those policy-driven internships, and I think that's really important for the future leaders, and I sort of hinted at this in what I said earlier on, that the future leaders are exposed to that high-level policy-making way of thinking, because there's a science and engineering graduates, they're going to be the ones trying to argue at board level in companies, they're going to be talking to governments, they're going to be advocates for this green and sustainable future that we all require. And policymakers are really important in inspiring those people.
Any further points?
No, I didn't know that. It's good to know. Thank you very much.
Any further questions?
The second point was how to establish a strong link between academia, science, and industry to face the challenges of management of chemicals, waste, and pollution. How do we establish a strong link between these groups?
The practicalities of what you're saying there, isn't it, Matt?
That's co-location, I think. We need to be working together with industry and with academic expertise, and have that policy angle to it too. It comes back to Graham's question. The answer to Graham's question: what mechanisms do we need? We need co-location, and we need that on a global level as well.
I would add that, I think mechanisms are incredibly important, and co-location is really powerful, but often it's about being able to speak each other's language, and it's a cultural point, isn't it? Yeah. It's having policymakers that aren't the technical experts, don't understand the science in the way that the scientists do, but at least know enough to know what kind of questions to ask, and then be able to listen to and respect the advice. And then it's about scientists or experts in general understanding often the financial, the political, the resourcing constraints that policymakers might be facing, and kind of giving suggestions and advice that are cognizant of some of those barriers. So for me, it is mechanisms, but it's also that kind of softer cultural point about making sure that we're all genuinely working. We are walking the talk, and we are working together to solve those problems in more than just name only, I think.
Thanks, Rachel. Any more points online?
Yeah, I think there's a question related to this from academics, which is the current academic teaching and research culture does not encourage involvement of scientists in policy work. What can the government do to encourage more scientists into taking part in policy?
Richard was keen.
Let me skip in as somebody who used to be a dean, and so it was part of my job to determine, for instance, whether somebody, well, as more as head of department even, whether somebody might be relieved of one part of academic activity because they were taking part in another. And that brings me back to the qualities of this panel. It will need to be prestigious. It will need to be such that as a head of department of chemistry, as I was, or a dean as I was, that person comes to me and says, I want to dedicate time to this activity. It will mean that I can't do other things. And it needs to be sufficiently prestigious, not for that person to be attracted to it, but for me as their manager and as their institution to be attracted to it. So I will say, yes, I will relieve you of second marking, the bane of every academic's life, in order that you can have the time available to take part in this activity. And it really does matter, because the currency that the academic world deals in more than anything else is prestige.
Thanks, Tom. Do you want to say a comment?
No, I think something, maybe pick up on Tom or express that. I think it's value to which we put things. And how do we value the application of knowledge? How do we value the application of science? Is it in the solving of problems and things and tangibles, or is it solving the bigger issues and contributing in a different way? So I think that there's something for me about that focus and support and building on the science can contribute in so many different ways, as can academia, as can experience, and not cutting off or limiting aspirations or career paths or options. So as an organization, we have, 2/3 of my division are scientists. They are recruited, they've chosen a particular part to work in regulation, some of whom who will move and have moved into policy work, etc. So it's a core background, core skill set. Actually having, I think, that conversation, aspirations, role models of how that individual can make a difference in an area they feel that they can make a difference, and that being valued, not shut down by whatever, of course, academic environment or culture that exists. And that for me is something I think, that needs clearly to be broken through. Because one person in a particular role can achieve much more than 10 years in a different environment.
So you're saying we're starting to see some new links between chemicals policy and research culture that we may not have probed before. Yes, okay. One more question from
Bob
online.
has his hand up. Sir Bob.
Bob, do you want to come and comment?
Yeah, just a quick one on this particular issue. It's interesting to note in both IPCC and IPBES, one has to actually reject a huge number of applicants to be part of the assessment. They've got such a high standard now that scientists all around the world, especially from the UK and the US, really want to participate in them. And if anything, there's far more people want to participate than what I call slots available to write these various chapters. And what both IPCC and IPBES are also doing is they've got fellowships for young scientists, especially from developing countries, to give them a real opportunity to participate. The other thing to note is that, in the UK, every 5 years, universities are judged, not only on their academic excellence, but on the social value, a small percentage on the social value. And so I think this has helped to stimulate academics, young and old, or older, actually participate in these assessments. So there is a challenge. They do take a lot of time. It does take away time from effectively doing your own research and publishing your own paper. But actually, I think a lot of universities and funding agencies are now appreciating the role of the academics in these assessments.
Thanks, Bob. And I think within the work of the Royal Society of Chemistry, we've seen enthusiasm from the scientific community on these topics when awareness has been raised.
There's a question from Professor Helen Apsman. How would you structure this initiative?
Helen Apsimer, are you on the line? No, can't hear. How would we structure this initiative? Well, we've talked a bit about this before, haven't we? Rachel, do you have anything to add to that in terms of what you said already?
Two things. Firstly, if I may, if I come back on Bob's point for a bit earlier, I think the power is really in the people who will make up the assessments. The power is with them in order to create a virtuous circle, because the more good people we have involved, the more prestigious the panel will become. The more prestigious it becomes, the more governments listen to it, the more governments listen to it, the more funding it gets, the more funding it gets, the more prestigious it becomes, the better quality of people coming through. So I think there is, just to kind of reiterate something that was said before, this is a sort of step up moment. This is a do and not wait to be asked to be done to moment, because the success of the failure will rest on the caliber of the people that come through, more than the terms of reference, more than the structure, more than the mechanisms and all of those kind of things. So that is a preface to say I think that is all more important than the particular structure and mechanisms. My point on this is actually what I would like to see is structure and mechanisms that work for the people that this panel will be influencing, working with, giving advice to, and that means me not sitting here and saying this is how I would structure the panel. Actually, the way that I would like to see the panel structured is the way that to use a horrible phrase, and I don't quite mean it, the customer would like to see it structured. And so I think it'd be really interesting to follow the work of both the open-ended working groups on this, because I think we need to make sure that all of the plurality of voices are given an equal space to think about how it's structured and how it's funded.
Thank you. Thanks, Rachel. So I think that's the end of our questions now in the allotted time we have. Do the panelists have any final words that you'd like to express that you haven't had the opportunity to say? No?
Well, except thank you very much for organising this. It's been really fascinating from my perspective, and I really wholeheartedly support the campaign that the RSC is running. I think this is a really important initiative, and one that the UK is really proud to be part of, actually.
Okay. Any comments, Tom?
And I would just add that, let this not be the last one. I think that it has been useful. I hope the audience has found it useful, and I think it could provide a model for discussion of a lot of important topics.
Thanks, Tom. Any concluding remarks?
I think, for me as an invitee, just the number of people that have joined, and Vicky's the other side of the world, and we have others that have joined because it's clearly of importance. And I haven't heard anyone, from what they've said, or the questions saying this is not a good thing to do or what should be supported. It's almost moving on about how do we make it work then? What is the role that we play in the contribution? So I think, certainly feel there's a lot of support. It's about now how to sort of harness that and get it aligned to achieving clearly what the resolution's about in terms of setting up the panel. So that's been really interesting to hear.
Thanks. Matt, and then finally Vicky.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I would just like to reiterate the thanks for inviting me to this fascinating and really exciting opportunity. And just a final thought that comes back to that structure question really is that is that such a panel would and could and should learn from all the mistakes of the previous two intergovernmental panels. We don't need to make all the same mistakes again. It's great to have the contributions from Sir Bob, who understands many of those mistakes better than we do. So it's in a good place. It's in a good place to go forward because it has the learning from those previous two experiences, although things are different, obviously.
And Vicky, any comments?
Yeah, so I'll reiterate everyone's thanks for coordinating this. And as the magpies are starting to sing their morning song in the background outside my window, I think that this is obviously, as Matt just said, it's an opportunity for us all to be coming together and to raise the profile of the chemical profession, be it through industry, be it through academia, and also with government. And I think that it's probably that's going to be that platform that really takes the profession forward, and I'm really looking forward to being part of it.
Thanks, Vicky. So that concludes the panel, really. We have just an opportunity to reiterate the campaigns that are open at the moment. If you've enjoyed today's discussion and you support the comments made in the declaration, then I reiterate that the IPCP has a campaign for individuals to sign up to. And here are the details of that again. And these will be available on the website, on the Royal Society of Chemistry website. And also that the RSC has its own campaign for organisations to sign up to add their logo of support as well. Hopefully this will be shared at UNEA 5. So it just remains for me to say thank you to all of the panellists and delegates for your contributions today. Thanks to Minister Churchill. Please do express our thanks, Rachel. It was an excellent contribution. Tom Welton, thank you for being here today. Matthew Davidson, Richard Daniels and Rachel Irving for stepping in at short notice. And especially to Vicky for joining us at 4 a.m. in the morning, live from Australia today. Thank you very much. We look forward to UNEA 5, which, as we understand, will happen from the 28th of February to the 2nd of March, where we hope there will be demonstrable support for a new panel from a range of nations that will lead the UN to take action on this important issue to address this gap on independent science advice on global chemicals policy. Thank you for listening today, and please do consider adding your voice of support. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Vicky.
Thanks.
Oh,
Thanks.
sorry,
for,
I have turned my sound off here, so I can't hear anything. There we go. Sorry. Hi, Vicky.
You're right. No, thanks. Thanks for the invitation to participate.
It's all right. Oh, yeah, I hope you can get some sleep now.
Yeah, no, it's
Okay.
probably now actually time to start getting breakfast. Another cup of tea, and I'll be right for a couple of hours.
Wonderful. Well, yeah, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.
Yep, definitely. Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.